Awesome. Well, I know most of you guys, but I'll just share a quick intro. So my name is Kevin. I joined Sub2 in September of 2020. So when the group had about 500 to 600 people in it, now, close to 8,000, I think. Met my business partner through the military prior to getting into real estate. So I currently live in Connecticut outside of Hartford. He lives outside of Columbus, Ohio. And we decided on kind of the central Ohio market for a couple of reasons. One, to build a long-term portfolio. We just saw the opportunities there versus like the competition that I saw here. We also saw that property taxes were super low and landlord laws were pretty favorable versus the tenants have a lot of right in New England. So it just made sense from everything that we saw, and him being more on the project management side in Ohio. So with that being said, if you guys have any questions, happy to kind of like share more of my backstory if any of you don't know or are curious about something. But if not, I can kind of hop into the deal and share more about the opportunity. All right, we'll hop into it. I'm going to share my screen. So just for kind of a broader overview, this is a 36 unit apartment complex. It's two buildings, two 18 units. Everyone can see my screen all right?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. So this is just a quick video. So this is in downtown, the same town that my partner lives in. These are the two buildings here. Again, 3 stories each on each side, and then 18 units and 18 units. So that's kind of just like what the property itself is. As far as where we actually found the deal, we have a mentor that's pretty big on, or he kind of said this to us over lunch. He said, suck the oxygen out of the market. And so what he meant by that was, instead of casting a really broad net of, hey, let's hit 20 different markets and see if we can get a couple responses here and there. Instead of doing that, what he recommended was to hit everyone in this one zip code really hard, make sure that everyone knows us. And so, what that meant to us was just trying to get a hold of everyone we could, whether that was like word to mouth through the couple guys that we already knew, or mailing, calling, texting, and not in the sense of, how probably everyone's used to marketing. It's like, hey, Keith, are you interested in selling your house? Instead of doing that, it's like, hey, you probably don't get approached like this a lot. I'm a younger investor building my portfolio. I'd love to pick your brain on how you've scaled. And it's like a little off-putting at first, because they're used to getting the 20 calls a day, especially the guys that have owned these for 20 years in their own names. And ultimately we'd end up, having a couple calls, kind of BSing with them, small talk, asking them, stupid questions. Are you self-managing? What's that look like? How have you scaled? Are you bringing in partners? Just, questions for relevance, really. And ultimately, once we felt like we got to know them a little bit, we'd push for a lunch or a coffee. So every time I'm in Ohio, we try and sit down with these guys. And in a long-winded way of explaining where the deal came from, we had a lunch with an investor who literally, we did exactly what I just described. Initially texted him. He's like, fuck off, not selling my property. Then it turned into, all right, we're not interested in buying your property, just trying to learn how you scaled your portfolio. And he's like, what the hell? Like, no one ever says that. So he ended up calling me right away. Ended up talking to him for like 30 minutes. He's in his 50s, but he knows the bigger pockets. He learned from them when they first started. And when I was in Ohio, we ended up having a lunch and a couple beers with him. And how we end every conversation is like, hey, I know you're not looking to sell your portfolio right now. You're holding on to everything. But anyone in town like that you've connected with over the years that you can think of that we should try and reach out to? And he goes, well, there's this 36 unit that I'm not really interested in. It needs quite a bit of work, but I know he wants to sell. He kind of inherited it. He hasn't done a thing to the property, and there might be something there. A week later, we had a LOI on the property, and it was someone that we had marketed to. He never took the initiative to reach out to us from our mail or from voicemails or things like that. And so that's just one example of how like really getting to know people in your market can be pretty beneficial to actually yielding like a valuable conversation that turns into a deal. Does anyone have any like questions about that process or how to approach people or what that means? All right. So to kind of get into like the nitty gritty of it. So we walked all 36 units of this property and right away just had an idea of what the price was going to be. That already kind of said it was going to be 1.25, which is just under 35,000 a unit. And going off the 1% rule, we knew that 1 beds and 2 beds in the market rent for 800, all the way up to 950 to 1,000 for the 2 bedrooms. So from a like percent rule standpoint, we knew we would have quite a bit of room there right off the bat. So just from like a back of the napkin underwrite, it's like, okay, there's something there that's worth underwriting. It's not just like, no, they want too much, let's not bother. And that's kind of how we weed through deals pretty quickly. From there, we knew there was going to be a lot of renovations from him not actually going through the property or not touching the property for the past 5 years. And so that being said, we started just getting quotes. As soon as we had the LOI, we had 10 days to even get the EMD in, and then another 30 days of due diligence before our earnest money went hard. And just started getting quotes. There's balconies on those buildings that's going to be like the biggest part of our expense. They're starting to pull away from the building. And so that was something we had no experience with. So we just talked to every other investor we knew and said, hey, have you dealt with anything like this? Do you know any iron workers? And that ended up coming in at like $200,000. So over the course of the past month, we've, put together our renovation budget. Some things went up, some things actually went down depending on the quotes that we got. So there's definitely a learning process in understanding what your renovation budget is going to be with every project. There's nuances, and you're not just going to be able to say it's $25 a square foot, especially with multifamily properties. So definitely taking the time to like connect with people that have either done larger projects has been big for us to actually dial in our quotes, along with having our GC come and actually tour the units with us, get an idea. Okay, some of these are pretty rough, some of these are in great shape. So I'll kind of jump into like what the due diligence process looked like for us. So we went through all 36 of these units and identified the unit. We gave them a 1 through 5 rating on like how bad of shape they were in. I can share my screen real quick. All right. So these are the notes from our inspections. So we annotated what floor it's on, how many bedrooms. There's 24 1 beds and 12 2 beds, and then half of them have furnaces, half of them have electric radiant heat. So we just annotated all the water heater ages just to have an anticipation of, all right, when is this potentially going to need to be replaced, along with all of the furnaces, as you can see, are pretty old. And then just some notes like, this property or this unit was trashed. So there's 2 like really bad units. One's already out. So this just gives us an idea of like, okay, who do we want to keep? Like we want to keep all the 4s and 5s. We want to say, hey, we're bringing rents to market when we take over, but we want to work with you. We'll give you a discount on the rent. We'd like to move you into a nicer unit. So this just gives us an idea of who we want to specifically, set the expectation that like, hey, we are repositioning the property. A lot of work's going into it, but like we want to work with you. So this is like really helpful. A lot of people don't do this, especially a turn this large. Like it's really nice to have a solid idea of who all of your good tenants are that are actually taking care of the units. From there, this is our consolidated renovation budget. So again, we have like a pretty good idea of what interior unit turns cost just because we've done those on, quite a few of our other rentals at this point. So there really weren't too many surprises with these items. Once our contractor got in there, we do anticipate being able to get we use Lowe's and Menards, and we do think we'll be able to get some discounts on like the kitchen cabinets and all of the appliance packages just because of, doing potentially 36 units. As you can see here, our thought process is to try and retain, those 15 or so pretty nice tenants that are taking care of their units. So what we plan to offer them, instead of doing this full unit turn, is to offer them, hey, can we go in, give you guys an appliance upgrade, redo your fixtures and your countertops with granite, instead of trying to raise rents to 800 on them, hey, we can be at 700 or meet you kind of in the middle from where you are currently. On the top, as you can see from the video that we shared, there really isn't a ton of like landscaping work. There is quite a bit of asphalt work though. And again, the main cost being in those balconies, just over 200,000. So some of this stuff is just, you have to get into it. And some of this is going to be a guesstimate. So as you can see, those furnaces were older, but they're working. So we've got budgeted 25,000, which isn't enough to replace all of them. But as they come up, would be enough to replace 50% of them. Other than that, windows was another one. So we had this quoted out by 3 different companies, and then our contractor had already given us like a cost per window to install. Asphalt, we got a few different bids. So right now it's at about like 34,000 to do all the asphalt around the building. So again, this was just things that we had to piece together. There's some stucco peeling off the buildings. This is still a shot in the dark. We don't have a solid quote on it yet. We just kind of threw in 20 grand as a placeholder. So as far as, running like, your numbers on a renovation this large, just being like just under $1 million renovation with our contingencies and permitting and, a lot of variables involved. Unfortunately, with a project like this, what would happen is if we did start to go or anticipated going over budget on the back end, we definitely are going to take care of all these exterior items first. And so it might just mean we can't do premium unit upgrades on the back end when you have to kind of like shave off what we're doing. So maybe that means, we don't get 800 for rents, and instead of putting in granite, now we're putting in Formica to save a little money, things like that. So anyone have any questions with the renovation budget? John, anything? Feel like you're good at keeping me on track here, so I'm gonna use you.
Yeah, so I guess pretty much the process is you already have a GC that you work with in the area?
We do, yeah.
Okay. So your process is essentially walking your GC through and then getting quotes on specific things and kind of getting it put together. Now, on certain things, like you must get multiple quotes. Like I'm assuming you probably got a high quote for the steel stuff and you're like, we got to look somewhere else, right?
Yeah, so our GC is more like handling all of this interior stuff along with like the window installation, the painting of the buildings. Like for context, this is a Latin crew, so they don't specialize in asphalt as well and signage and stucco work. So that's when we go out to like this. The balconies are, think of like a welded steel with like a concrete platform. So that's a very specialty thing. So it's not like there's a million options, but we do have a couple quotes. And right now the cheapest one is the 205. So it's just a really expensive thing to do. They're actually gonna have to bring a crane in to support them while they're replacing the balconies. So it's a pretty intensive job. We haven't dealt with anything like this. So yeah, in those cases, all you can really do is get quotes and just talk to as many people as you can to get eyes on it and, any advice that they have.
Got you. And when you're doing like the tenant turnover, right? So you identify the tenants that are keeping their places nice and you're saying, hey, we'll work with you. What do you do with the other tenants?
Yeah, so right now they're all on. So I can kind of actually hop into the underwriting because I think this is a cool way. So this is Synthesis. This is like a multifamily underwriting calculator. And so they've got a ton of like subcategories that don't actually feed into calculations that you can utilize. So this is a rent turn tab. So really the thought process is that they're all month-to-month tenants, and the 1 beds are at 450 and the 2 beds are at 500 to 525. And so what we're going to do is go in and start raising rents on existing tenants that don't necessarily, we don't want to keep them and they don't have any upgrades that will be done to their unit. And that's just our way to almost like force them out because they're going to say, yeah, I'm not paying this, I'm moving out, or we end up having to evict them. So we have a time delay of not placing any like new tenants until month 4. This is just kind of a way for us to, get a head start on the renovations without having to, like, in our underwriting, be placing tenants by month 2, which probably is likely that happens because we'll have 1 or 2 vacancies going in. But this is a good illustration of a full reposition. So we're underwriting that there'll be 6 units vacant at all times. It likely will be a little higher initially because tenants are going to, move out when we bump rents right away. Hopefully with the 20 that we want to keep, it's not going to be like a max exodus from the property. But this is how we like underwrite the tiers of placing, 3 tenants for the 1 beds, month 4, month 5, 2 to give us like a little break. But we'll be pushing pretty hard to stabilize, before that 16-month mark, really. So this kind of makes sense.
So what's so important about the 16-month mark? Like, why did you pick that?
Yeah, so I can jump into like the full, like, this is the dashboard tab, and this is a pretty good illustration of like assumptions for the deal, which most of these aren't assumptions now other than the exit. So the reason for us to stabilize at the 16-month mark is because we'll be taking this to Freddie Fannie agency debt, which is like a non-recourse loan backed by the government. And so because of how deep of a discount the deal is, instead of raising our $700,000 that we need for a down payment to the lender and our 25% of the renovation funds that we need to bring, we're raising the 700,000 as debt from a private investor. And so he doesn't want to lock his money up in a deal for 5 years. And we didn't want to give him equity if we didn't have to. We wanted to control majority equity. And so by doing that, we're actually raising that money as debt, but we have a 2-year timeline. An agency debt, you need to be stabilized for 3 months to execute a refinance. So if we're stabilized, again, this actually models a 14-month mark stabilization. So we would start the process here, but really we have until the 24-month mark. And so we just want to kind of create a buffer of time between stabilizing, starting the refinance, because we need 3 stabilized months before we can execute that with agency debt. Is that a good answer?
Dude, yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, that's what I figured. I was figured it had to do with either your exit as far as flipping it or refinancing it and paying off your lender. So, but yeah, no, that makes sense. So you had private money for the whole purchase of the property and the rehab, like that's all just private money?
No, so yeah, I'll hit on that right now. So purchase of the property is 1.25 for the 36 units. So it comes out to just under $35,000 a unit. So this is actually a lender that we've worked with before. We just formally started the process, ordered the appraisal. We've got a term sheet for this, and they're pretty good about holding that through the whole process. So we would be putting 25% down of the 1.25. So that comes out to 312. And then they fund 75% of the rehab. So we're right around 950 on a renovation budget. And we have to bring 25% of the renovation budget. So rate right now, 7.5. That it's not going to get any better, but they're already anticipating another like 25 basis point hike. So we're not going to see another bump. So this is a little high, which does suck. They are giving us 24 months of interest only with a 30-year amortization schedule. And there's no prepayment for us to sell it or to refinance the agency debt, which is cool. So to kind of circle back and answer your question, we basically need to come up with the 312 down payment, the 25% of the rehab, so 240 call it, and closing costs. So, right around 800,000 with some reserves built in. Does that answer that question better?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for.
So essentially in first position is a real bank that we're using. And in second position is our private money lender. Now, what can be difficult with raising private money is the first position lender going, where's the 700 grand coming from? And if you say, oh, it's coming from a private lender in second position, they're going to say, yeah, we don't allow second positions, which is very common for a lot of banks. So what we did in this case is we actually, instead of having a second position loan, we gave our private lender 5% equity in our entity. And what that does is A, allows the bank to look at where the money's coming from and go, oh, it's coming from a partner in the deal. And that way we don't have to give, any of like the second position no and work through all that crap and get the money seasoned in our account. And the bank's still asking questions like, where'd 700 grand come from? And the agreement and the operating agreement is that 5% equity is basically the agreement says we're going to pay 10% interest only. We have 2 years to pay them back. If we needed a 1-year extension at the end of the 2 years because the market's crazy, we have the option to extend for an extra 0.5 point fee. And upon a successful refinance and return of capital, his 5% equity comes back to us. Now, typically, and this is different on lenders, but 10, 15, 20% equity in an entity means you need to sign on the debt. So because he's under that threshold and only has 5% equity, it's not like he has to sign on the debt or be involved in the deal. It's just, a formality thing for the lender to show him an operating agreement with a partner that's bringing the money. So kind of a cool strategy to keep in mind with like private lenders, but like still keeping them out of the deal, but letting the bank, basically internally suffice, okay, this is where the funds are coming from. It's a partner versus another lender. Any questions there on like how to structure that? All right. Can't see you guys, but I'm going to take that as a good to go. So the biggest triggers in a BRRRR is always your refinance, because there's just a huge sensitivity to where the hell our rate's going to be and what's my cap rate going to be on a refinance. And so we kind of stress test this to see. So our all-in capital is this 2.335. And so it's really like kind of a shot in the dark thing. No one knows what the cap rate is going to be. No one knows what the interest rate is going to be, there's just no way to know those things. And so the way we looked at this is there's actually an investor in town that owns like $15 million worth of real estate. and he really wanted this property. And again, we just kind of snuck in there at the right time. And he's kind of our golden parachute. If market was shit and we had to sell this thing and get like our investors' money back at the 3-year mark, we know that from an NOI basis, at year 3, that we can bring this cap rate up to 7.5% and know that we're paying back all of our investors' money. And that's like an easy thing to sell him, because hey, like if worst comes to worst, someone's getting this thing at a 7.5% cash on cash return for a building that just had $1 million in renovations in it. And again, this is a worst case scenario, but this is a way that we kind of stress test our deals to see what that looks like if things do go south. Ultimately, we're not underwriting, a sale, but I just plugged in year 10 because the calculator needs a year. And this rate, so don't know if I threw it in this folder. Yeah, I don't have it in this folder, but we've just kind of listened to Neil Bawa, who is a multifamily syndicator. They've got over $1 billion in assets. He's a very analytical guy. And basically, ever since this whole banking crisis went on with some of these banks, and the Federal Reserve has pivoted. And the reason for that is their number one job or role in the marketplace is to keep like a stable market. And then their second role is to enforce or regulate inflation. And so they were raising the interest rates very quickly to combat inflation. But what that did was it put a lot of pressure on banks. And so as soon as the pressure on banks and a couple of these, SBB fails, and then this bank overseas fails, and then now there's a lot of pressure on banks, they had to pivot. And so now, instead of it going, hey, we're bringing interest rates to 8%, who knows where the Federal Reserve is going to have to bring them to combat inflation. Now they have to tune them down to basically keep the banking system from collapsing. And so it was a very quick pivot, but that is like their number one priority. So that comes over combating inflation. So again, this is like totally a shot in the dark. We do have quite a few options with the deal. So we threw in 7% agency debt right now is actually in like the high 5s. This bank that we're using being at 7.5 does suck, but we've worked with them before. We're super confident on them performing, and just with the size of the renovation budget, we were a little nervous to work with the other bank that provided a term sheet to us. But any questions on any of like the underwriting or how this works? I'm happy to share this tool. It definitely takes some time to like play around with. There's a lot of different things you can adjust. But anything?
So I had a quick question. So is the private lender covering the down payment and 25% of the renovation costs? So essentially,
Exactly.
coming out of pocket, not coming out of pocket.
Yeah, we're not coming out of pocket at all. He's bringing the 25% down payment for the actual 1.25 purchase. He's bringing the 25% of the renovation budget. He's bringing the closing costs, so 50 to 75 grand, and then he's bringing another 75,000 in reserves, which comes out to that roughly 700,000. So yeah, that's like a pretty ideal scenario. If that hadn't have worked and he like wasn't interested, we were gonna approach 2 lenders and say, hey, could you guys both do 350? Same structure. We'd give them both like 5% equity in the operating agreement until the refinance. But that was, fortunately, he was willing to do that.
And this and the private lender is just somebody else you've developed a relationship with in the area?
Yeah, he's not in the area. He actually is, without sharing too much, he's a executive at like a publicly traded company. He's a vice president. So not a lot of time, likes real estate, has, a good chunk of liquid capital that he's willing to lend, and 10% interest only for him is like awesome. So he's pretty happy with that. And one maybe like thing to hit on there is our best private lenders are not in real estate, because all of us being in real estate, we're pretty aggressive with our returns, right? If I'm lending my money, I'm not lending it for 8%. So just keep that in mind when you're networking with people, specifically, maybe spending more time on building the relationship with the guys or girls that are not in real estate and don't have a lot of time, but have the capital. To hit on the lending again real quick, we use Jamie Litzler, which is kind of cool to find out that Pace also uses him. And I didn't know that when we had started using Jamie. So this is our 3rd loan with Jamie. He's not like your magic unicorn lender that is going to magically, find you multifamily debt if you don't have either the personal like financial statement, the liquidity, or a partner that meets those things. But he's a straight shooter, and he'll fight for us on certain terms and things when we ask him to. And he's been awesome to work with. He also this is a big thing that people talk about brokers and go, I don't want to pay the 1 point or their fee. He shelters us from a lot of the BS from the lender. And what I mean by that is they'll ask for just an excruciating amount of documents, or it's like, well, they already have everything they really need and they're still asking for an updated this or another bank statement. And he'll really put his foot down and be like, nope, we've provided everything you need to make an informed decision on this deal. Like, this is all you're getting. And it comes off a lot better coming from him than if I were to say that to the bank on the back end. So that's been huge. And he fights really hard to get the best terms. So highly recommend, if you are even on the residential side, if you're having trouble getting like good financing, a broker that actually has good relationships that's going to fight for you. And I know there's some people in sub 2 that are probably like nationwide, which is really a tough thing because Jamie will also, he's very familiar with the Midwest. And so he'll go to bat with the appraisers for you as well. I mean, we've never had an appraisal come in anywhere close to like, a sensitivity. We bought a 16 units for 700,000 and Jamie got him to push the appraisal to like 900,000. So there's like a ton of instant equity right away. And that wasn't something that would have been achieved on our own. Like, he knows all the guys in the local market. So working with someone that's actually in the market, has the relationships, worth its 1 point all day. And again, we've worked with this lender already, and we're still paying Jamie to interface with them for us because he's clearly proved his worth. So highly recommend that. I know he gets spammed a lot by people in sub 2. So again, he's not like a magic pill, but if you really have an opportunity, that you're working, he's definitely the guy. Let's see. As far as modeling, like, where can we bring our rents? Running rent comps is actually pretty hard. And if you don't know a market, it's like, it could be a shot in the dark because there's 1-beds in this area from 600 all the way to like 1,000. So that's a pretty big range, and that can really affect your pro forma modeling of the deal. So one thing, having a team, and I know like Bigger Pockets hits on this, but like having a rock star team is a real thing. Having an agent, a contractor, people that can like get back to you quick with real numbers. This is your rent comps. This is your ARV. Like, this is everything, is super effective to make more competitive offers, but B, also like capitalize on opportunities quicker than other people can. And so that's a problem that we've had with casting a super broad net, because we have done some marketing to Indiana and Kentucky. It's like, I just don't know those markets. So it takes me significantly longer to underwrite properties and to ultimately make decisions. And so not only make decisions, but decisions that I'm confident in, I'm now adjusting my numbers to give me a little bit more security and, taking the conservative side. So then we get beat out by someone else. So by really knowing your market or one market, you're able to be more competitive. So share my screen again, but literally reached out to our property management company and said, hey, can you just pull us, the lender is going to want to see this, but can you provide just internally of the company what you guys are seeing for 1-beds? So these are 1-bed rent comps, again, all the way from 700 to 940 with utilities included, none included. So it's all over the place, but this is like a great indicator because we, underwrote to 750, which is kind of like lower middle of the pack, especially for fully renovated units. So, realistically, we're probably going to be placing at 800 plus, especially because we're going to be adding some air conditioning units to these units. So just a huge resource to have a property management company that's going to give you like, yes, this is where you can push rents to, and really have quality feedback versus you looking, I saw some 1-beds listed for 1,200 on Zillow. It's like, you don't actually know if they're getting that. You really don't, have enough to make an informed decision there. So can't stress that enough. Having a property management company in the market and also having your own rentals in one market, it gives us like, we're getting 775 at our 1-beds over here and they're not renovated. There's no way we're not getting 800 here. So that's, another thing to hit on. But other than that, I mean, I'm happy to dive into any components more, but that's kind of like a rough overview of the deal, how we found it. Actually, I'm going to pull the underwriting back up. This is another huge thing about knowing your market, which made this deal like even sweeter. So this is the P&L tab. And the point of doing the rent turns is like, it does give you an idea of how the project's going to go, gives you a timeline to like, hey, are we on track? Are we behind? What do we need to do? But also it gives you an average of what your rent amount is for the year. So 632 is like our year one average. So I adjust the underwriting to reflect that, hey, we're going to be moving rents, to 632 and then stabilizing out at 847. So to come back to the P&L tab, 632, 847, year one, year two. So everything on the underwriting here, just like some rules of thumb that we use, is if taxes are pretty low and you're buying the property for way more than what the property sold for previously, you should anticipate a tax hike. So I've written a full tax reassessment at the $1.25 million purchase price, year one and year two. As you can see here, I underwrote no taxes for the next 8 years. It'll really be 10 years. So because of the amount of work we're putting into the property, the municipality is actually giving us a 10-year 100% tax abatement. So once we spend more than 50% of the purchase price in rehab, so 1.25 purchase, as long as we spend over 650,000 in work, we get a 10-year 100% tax abatement, which is $23,000 in additional income that's staying in our pockets every year. So that's huge. And not that the deal didn't work without that, but that's just like an extra cherry on the top. And by knowing our market and knowing, hey, this is rehab and there's some extra upside there, like just for the cap rate assumption, which is a way to evaluate income at a cap rate. So 23,000 divided by 0.07 is $328,000 in extra value that the property is worth for 10 years in the bank's eyes and a buyer's eyes. So that's going to be huge. Bunch of people hopping in.
Is that something you had to apply for, or it's already?
No, we just need to show them receipts, and we've actually had a few meetings with Destination Downtown. They're seeing if they can actually give us any grants for any of the improvements we're making as well. But that just came through like networking with people in the municipality and in Destination Downtown that are trying to like regentrify the area. Other underwriting, like as you can see, we're underwriting for definitely evicting some tenants that when we bump rents, they're not going to want to leave. Repairs and maintenance, kind of a rule of thumb that we use is $800 a unit a year. Now, even having a portfolio for 2 years now, because everything we've bought, we've repositioned, it's really hard to have like an internal know of what repairs and maintenance cost. So the reason that we're at $400 for year one is because of how extensive the renovation budget is. Any unit turns or major repairs are going to be categorized as like capital expenditures from the renovation budget. And as you can see, stabilizing out going into year three, now we're up to that $800 a unit per year. So it's just kind of a rule of thumb that we use for repairs and maintenance. Advertising, we are going to be using an apartments.com like gold membership, which allows us to keep the property listed and build a waiting list year round for the units. And then this is something that no one, and like this is huge for us because we saw how much we paid in leasing fees. But awesome. Thanks, Keith. But our management company charges $650 to place a tenant, or first month's rent, whichever is lesser. So $650 is less than any tenant we're placing. So that's a lot of money, especially anticipating again with the turns here that we're going to be going through and not necessarily replacing all of the tenants because we do want to keep them, but requalifying them for the higher rent amount in the renovated units. So some of them probably won't qualify even though they keep their tenants, their units in nice shape. We'll try and retain them if we can, but just something that we wanted to be more conservative about and underwrite. We're going to have like an 80% churn year one is essentially what this is. And then they charge $150 or $100 for renewal. So as you can see, typically the like nationwide average is the average tenant stays for 3 years. So this is going forward year two and on. We're underwriting for 30% of our tenants moving every year, or 33%, which means we're 650 times 12 units and then renewing the other 24. So this is a pretty big expense that a lot of people don't think about, especially, with like a single family where your average tenant stays more than 3 years. It's a little bit different, but on a multifamily property, like leasing fees is a huge fee, as you can see here. Does anyone have any questions on like expenses or income or any of like how we model a deal or anything in the underwriting? All right. But yeah, this, again, the taxes is huge. And that's just by, knowing the market really and having relationships that, there's like something that we can capitalize on there. which is, definitely a huge upside. But
Hey,
yeah,
Kevin, could I ask you a question?
absolutely, Alan.
Good to see you. I haven't seen you in a little while.
You as well.
Yeah, can you just comment, because you're obviously familiar with the Midwest market. Is the market you're in Ohio, is that significantly different from other parts of Ohio? First of all, like Cleveland, by extension, Indiana. I wouldn't go so far as Illinois. I know Chicago, that's a whole different market, but say Indiana on the one side or Western Pennsylvania on the other side?
Yeah, so I'm certainly not familiar with like Illinois, and we have looked at markets in Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. So I definitely could speak to those three a little bit more. But I think one major difference between looking at the Midwest versus even New England is I can be to Boston in an hour and a half. And not to say that Boston is the same market as Hartford, but everything's very commutable here. So there aren't tertiary markets in Connecticut. Like you're always 15 minutes from everything for the most part. And so when taking that into account, Ohio, we're a secondary market of Columbus, which is still 40 minutes outside of Columbus. And so to speak to that, we look at Columbus as a whole and go, okay, Columbus is doing really well. It's a hot market. And we've never had, even like on the single family side, we've never had insane growth that they saw in Columbus or that we saw in New England, and which is still, has been really hot. Now, the cool thing is about that is we're not underwriting for like a huge decline in rents or homes. We've actually seen our single family homes just stay pretty stagnant over the past 2 years. They still continue to sell, very quickly. So to fully answer your question, it's still just a super affordable market. Like when you have 1 bedrooms at, 750 to 800 and 2 bedrooms around 1,000, but your median income is still 50 to 60,000. It's a pretty affordable place for people to live. And I think COVID also, people almost wanted to move right outside the city, especially knowing they didn't have to go back to work. They can work hybrid, remote. I'm not going to say in the country, but town of 50,000 people where they have kind of the flexibility and, the land and the ability to do outdoor things, which is, I think, definitely more of like a Midwest thing. I'm not sure if that fully answers like what you were getting at, but.
No, that it sort of confirms, I think, what a lot of us thought anyway. Obviously, the price points, both purchase and rent, are much more attractive there. I'm just wondering because you're really niched down and the intricacies of that market, whereas people will talk generally about Indianapolis or Pittsburgh or Cleveland. I'm just not sure. Like even between Columbus and Cleveland, is there a big difference or are they similar? Or is Cleveland more Boston-like?
Cleveland is a market that we really stay away from. And the reason for that is it's probably like not as bad Detroit, where you can make a lot of money in Detroit if you know the right areas and you're on the uptrend and you like truly know the market. And that's how Cleveland is. We know a couple guys there that do really well and they know exactly what pockets and it's streets there where you can be 2 streets away and you're good and 2 streets over and you're losing a lot of money. So we don't look at anything in Cleveland, not interested in owning in that market, doesn't really have a good trajectory in our opinion. To speak to like our market a little more, we're 1 county south of the new Intel development, so a multi-billion-dollar project. Honda's putting a new plant in 20 minutes in the other direction. So, it's just such an affordable place and they make it, I'll say also pretty attractive for businesses and from the tax perspective that the trends look really good. Columbus itself is only growing. And so that's, it gives us even more confidence. We're not underwriting for appreciation. All of our rents are today's rents. Do I think these rents are, $850, $900 for a 1 bed? I sure would like to think so, but we're not underwriting for those things. We're trying to underwrite on actuals, what are rents today? What are valuations today? What are interest rates today? And again, who knows where interest rates are going to be in 1, 2, 3 years, but we just try and stress test the sensitivity the best that we can so that, if things aren't quite where we thought they were going to be, there's still room to exit the deal, refinance the deal, sell the deal if we have to.
So your appreciation is more value add driven. Is that
always? Yeah, we're always forcing appreciation. Other than the handful of like creative finance deals that we've done, like the seller finance deal, we bought a turnkey house at 2% interest. So there wasn't value to be added. It was already, completely renovated. But other than that, we're buying properties and still utilizing like a BRRRR strategy type model.
Okay. Okay. And just briefly, in Indianapolis, Indy, as they seem to call it out there, go or no, is that more Detroit or Cleveland like, or more Columbus like?
I'll be honest, we started marketing to a few markets in Indiana and Kentucky at the start of this year. Indianapolis was not one of them. One of the reasons is we do a lot of direct mail. And so any major metro typically gets hit pretty hard from even out of state investors. They go, oh, Indianapolis looks good. So we went around all of the secondary markets of Indianapolis, and none of them actually looked very good. And so we decided not to market to Indianapolis, but instead Fort Wayne, Columbus, Bloomington, Indiana, and then Lafayette or Lebanon, two different like areas northwest of Indianapolis. So those are the four markets in Indiana, and then Louisville, Lexington, and Bowling Green in Kentucky. And Louisville's actually turned into another like Columbus or Indianapolis, where it's just so competitive. Our response rate's so low, it's just not worth it for us to market there. And so again, we like Lexington, phenomenal market, better response rate because it's not hit quite as hard. But for identifying those markets, we literally just looked at population growth, job growth, all census data that's pretty easily accessible to see like what's happened. We like at least 1%. Lexington is just like checks every box. There wasn't a zip code that we could remove from our list that we wouldn't want to buy in. Everything looks really good in that market. Same idea with Bloomington and Lafayette, or Bloomington and Columbus, Indiana, which are just south of Indianapolis, both towns of like 70,000 people. And then rents. We don't want rents in a market where rents are $400 for a one bed. It's hard to underwrite those deals. You can already imagine the tenant class you're getting into. So we don't have necessarily a rule of thumb on like minimum rents, but we want to see like 650 plus for one beds typically in a market that we would want to buy in.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Kevin. Thanks for this presentation too.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the questions. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to kind of open it up or elaborate on anything more if anyone has anything that, they specifically want to dig into. What do you got, Keith? Anything good?
No, I thought it's awesome. Yeah, nothing offhand.
Okay.
I got a quick question. Where do you recommend trying to raise capital when you're trying to get such large numbers?
Yeah, so this is an investor that we have worked with twice before with pretty large amounts, and we just ask them for more every time. Start with who you know. It's very hard to, find a VP of a company that you didn't have a pre-existing relationship with. So I would definitely start with like your internal network. A pretty good investor that's not this one that we have is my retired uncle. Does very well, or did very well, retired, just has some capital and lives like a very modest life, and just brought him like a basic presentation of an opportunity. Approached him more so that like, hey, I've been creating this presentation, and I wasn't asking him for money. All right. I was, but I didn't say that. I just said, hey, I've been working on this presentation. I know you're pretty business savvy. Would you mind just like giving me some feedback on what you think I could do better? Went and gave him like this arbitrary pitch for a deal. And it turns into, and that's like an easy entry to ask people for advice versus money. It's easier to get in the door. By the end of the conversation, he's like, hey, I'd be interested in doing something like this, if you have anything that comes up. So I always recommend that to people is put something together, even if it's like a fake deal, and just go ask someone if you can, pitch it to them and get advice on what you could do better versus asking someone for money that's like, I don't know. So that's definitely typically better received.
Excellent. And then a second question. Obviously, this is a niche and you're going for large multifamily, and you mentioned you have a mentor. So are there other groups that you've obviously joined to get mentorships?
Yeah, so again, joined Sub 2 in 2020 of September. And then the next October, November, we joined Jake and Gino, which is a pretty like multifamily orientated group. And it's a higher price point. I think it was $20,000 to join that group. So the cool thing about that though is it's like a high barrier to entry. And so anyone joining the group is like, all right, they came up with 20 grand and they're not taking payments like Paces over 6 months or whatever it is. So the quality is really screened, and a lot of like capitals also come from that group, and potential, partners. We're working with some people in that group for portfolios of like complexes that are too large to not syndicate. So that's been the only other group that we've joined that's been really valuable for us.
That makes 100% sense. And when you were evaluating this deal, did you already anticipated your value add? When you did that, you must have already compulated what the value would be of that property when you're done with your value add, right?
Yeah, so we use a couple different things. We look at what's the net operating income, and pretty much, I'm sure not everyone's super familiar, but income, whatever your rental income is, plus whatever other income, laundry, pet fees, things like that, minus your operating expenses is your net operating income. And so how you formulate your valuation is on that NOI divided by a cap rate gives you, whatever the value of the property is. So we've had things appraised from anywhere from like a 6 to a 7.5 cap in the market. And knowing that this would be a fully renovated property with $1 million in work, it's like I'd be willing to take the gamble that this sells at a 6 cap if we had to sell it and rates were in the 4 to 5% range. Again, not knowing where that is, we just elevated it up to that 7 to 7.5% cap rate to just, again, test the sensitivity, like, hey, where do we push this thing? If things aren't, market conditions aren't perfect and we have to refi in 2 years, which they likely won't be. So our broker, Jamie, will do a sensitivity and play with that. And he usually gets very close. Again, knowing all of the appraisers, he kind of knows where things are going to shake out at. But another thing we look at is like, what's the price per door, right? I love the 1% rule. That's just like a great tool to see, all right, does this even cash flow? Because I could say, oh, the thing's worth $5 million because of the work we put into it. Like we created, all this equity. But that'd be like 200,000 a unit, which nothing in this part of Ohio is ever going to be worth 200,000 a unit. A, and B, debt service coverage ratio. If it does not cash flow, no lender is going to finance it, and no one we know is buying a property for $3 million cash. Like, it's not a good way to scale a portfolio. So really, what that means is NOI divided by annual debt needs to be over 1.25. So this is like the last thing I do to test, the deal is what is the sensitivity of that debt service coverage ratio? So I just reverse engineer it. And I can share my screen real quick on kind of how like we did this. So I look at this, the NOI, year 2, year 3, and go, okay, if we need the extension, into year 3, our projected NOI is $256,000. So divide that by 1.25, and that comes out to $204,800 is the most that we could pay in debt per year. So then what I do is go and plug in, all right, our total all-in project amount is 2.335. And what I'll do is I'll just plug that in on a 30-year term with that loan amount and just keep plugging in interest rates. So, okay, we can refi and hit DSCR at 7%. Okay, we can hit it at 8%. Oh, at 8.5%, that's when we no longer could refinance all of this capital out. So that's really the biggest thing that I think a lot of people don't talk about, especially in multifamily, is does it cash flow? Because that's what matters the most. This could appraise for $6 million. The bank is only going to refi us out as long, whatever hits a 1.25 debt service coverage. So long way of hopefully answering your question, but that's like the last sensitivity analysis that I do to see, like, that to me is the truth. That's not a number that you can fake or a valuation that's arbitrary to how an appraiser's feeling on a day. It's like that, it just is what it is.
Yeah, I'm 100%. I get it, definitely. And I get the reverse engineering. There always has to be, what is the exit strategy? And as an investor, I've never done large multifamily, but you're not selling to anyone that's just going to make a mistake very easily. So it has to be calculated. Opposed to the single family, people make mistakes all the time and kind of get lucky. But yeah, that's what I thought. So is there a chance that you kind of already thought do the value add and immediately sell the property?
It's pretty unlikely because there's so much money going into the downtown area that unless we had to sell, which would be like market's bad, we have to pay our private investor back, which he would be able to work with us for more than 3 years if we had to. But I mean, this is like a 10-year hold. Like this property, would be worth that 125 a door with the area and location that it's in 5 to 10 years, as long as we don't have to sell it. Is it possible we get fed up in 2 years and we're like, hey, we've got an offer for 3.5 and that's $1 million that we'd split between us? Like maybe, but right now we are trying to just like build our portfolio and actually get to like a passive income goal versus cash on hand. So I think it'd be stupid to say no, we would never evaluate selling. Like we would sell any property we have at any time for the right price. So yeah,
Awesome. Thank you.
definitely. Anyone else have any questions or anything they want to dive back into?
I guess I got one more quick question, and that's the marketing campaign. So you mentioned that you niche and you focus on just one concentrated area, which makes absolute sense. So you said you did direct mail, and I know that when you're doing large multifamily, it's a very small population that you're going toward. And you also said you're doing texting. Is that what your other?
Yeah, so I have a list of 40 people, like 40 mom and pop owners now, that I'll do whatever I can to get a hold of them now, because we just need a relationship. Like we're willing to play the long game. There's so many other people that are doing outreach that are just like me now. And when I'm, calling these people and saying like, yeah, I don't give a shit about your properties, they're like, what the hell? And then like, yeah, we want to learn like how we can better our portfolio and improve operations. And then people are so much more receptive to having a conversation. It leads to lunch, just like this deal. And next thing you know, he's referring over another owner that we hadn't contacted. We do the mail to kind of like stay in front of people. It doesn't produce like a ton of deal flow. We have bought a lot of smaller stuff from it. So like 4 units, 5 units, which are some of our best deals, honestly. So that's why we continue to do it. And it does keep us in front of some of these larger owners where they're never going to call us because they're getting hit so hard. It's just like they don't know who's, an actual buyer, who's a wholesaler, so they're not going to waste their time. But it gives us a little more credibility when we eventually make contact over the phone or in person. Like, oh yeah, I've seen your guys' letters before. Like, so that's maybe like also a credibility aspect to think about there. And hitting such a small area, it's just only so many people that own, multifamily properties that aren't like now, institutions are coming in, and that's just going to phase out mom and pops in the long run, I think. So,
yeah, that 5% partnership there with your private lenders are pretty good. That's a smart little trick, lad. Remember a ways back when I was telling you about that trailer park I was trying to buy?
yeah.
That's why the bank wouldn't allow that to happen, because they found out that I wasn't bringing any money to the table. So with the private lender, they said, nope, you need 10% down yourself, seasoned money.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good little trick to know.
Yeah, absolutely. When you have like the financial statement to show the net worth, but you don't have the liquidity, or enough to show where the liquidity is coming from, that's definitely a pretty big upside.
So you gave him 5. He's on the LLC for 5%, and then the deal is when you repay the loan, he relinquishes the 5%.
Exactly. And this is being drafted as we speak, so I'm sure there's going to be like some adjustments we have to make, but he doesn't want equity. Like that's not for him. It's just for the bank to say, okay, the money's coming from this partner versus this lender that's second position. That was actually something that Jamie brought up as like a workaround, the broker. I didn't even, that wasn't me that thought of it, but
Yeah, I was just going to say, I might have missed that trick that both Keiths are referring to. Could you just briefly recap that?
Yeah. So basically, because we're raising $700,000 in private money, that's a lot of money to like show through our account that's not seasoned. So the lender's, saying, all right, where's the 700,000 coming from? By giving this private lender 5% equity in our operating agreement in the entity, knowing that, hey, once we refinance, you're going to get, that 5% goes back to us. And it was just kind of a placeholder in the operating agreement so that the lender can look at it and go, oh, the money's coming from a 5% partner versus a private lender in second position, which most lenders don't like second position. In Ohio, we don't have to notarize operating agreements. It's like we could have 2 copies. He doesn't even need to, actually have 5% equity. It can be a PS, doc to check a box for the lender. And because he only has 5%, he doesn't have to sign on the debt or be a grantor or anything like that.
Does he actually retain the 5% to a point where he feels, like he's recouped his investment, or?
Yeah, so the agreement is that we pay him 10% interest only monthly for the hold period. And then once we refinance, after we have 2 years to refinance, we pay him back all of his capital, and then he relinquishes the 5% equity. We also have the option to extend if we have to for a 0.5 point for 8 months or another year, forget which. And then that's kind of how it's being drafted right now.
And that's equity in the LLC, not in the property.
Correct.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are you creating new LLCs for each property?
Yeah, so we try and break. It really depends, but the short answer is yes. We typically try and separate $1 million in assets between entities. Obviously, this is over $1 million, but you're not going to have multiple entities for one property. So yes, we have like our residential portfolio in an entity, our 20-unit complex in an entity, each mobile home park in an entity, the 16 units we bought in an entity. So we try and break everything up, by asset, especially for like multifamily or mobile home parks.
Makes sense.
One thing to add though, that definitely helps us for tax purposes is, so I have a Wyoming LLC. I'm the individual owner. My partner has a Wyoming LLC, individual owner. Those two entities come together to own our Ohio holding company, which is like our brand, Red Door Equities. And then all those other entities I just mentioned are owned solely by Red Door Equities. So what that allows us to do is produce 1K1 for Red Door Equities, which takes gains from the flipping company and bonus depreciation on mobile home parks, which is insane, and wipe all that flipping income out, all the rental income from everything else. So it all gets mushed together, which ultimately reduces your taxes. And one thing that people don't talk about also is real estate professional. You have to be a real estate professional in each entity, actually each property, and it depends what our accountant isn't the best at explaining that to us, but it gets kind of weird. It's like, how do you prove in all 6 of our entities? But by having it also consolidated, we can kind of like pass one entity down over as like a blanket.
2 thoughts on that, Kevin. If you ever feel like in your spare time, which it doesn't sound like you have a lot of, putting together some sort of a tree or a diagram that just shows that hierarchy, that would be fantastic. And the other thing is, are there any trusts or trustees used in any of that, or is it all LLC driven?
Good question. Yeah, I can definitely share that that kind of like organizational chart. We do have that. It's easier for lenders to see that too and like understand what's going on. So I do already have that, but yeah, we have talked about setting up a trust. Haven't at this point. So I literally know nothing about trusts, but at this point, it's all just typical LLC entities.
So it's LLCs within LLCs as members until it filters down at some point to you and your partner as individuals.
Correct. And that's for the Wyoming LLCs because of the anonymity and charging order protection.
Okay, great. Is your partner's also Wyoming?
It is, yep.
Okay, great. Did you happen to go through Prime and at Pace's suggestion, or do you use somebody else?
We
Anderson or?
Not even Anderson. We just went to a company. I want to say it's like Wyoming LLC's attorneys or something. It's like $300 a year. It's a very minimal expense, and that's for like them to file the minutes and renewal and pretty much everything. It's like at cost. So
yeah, it's crazy inexpensive. Oh, that raises one good last question. Sub LLCs, as you go down the chain, do they have to be Ohio based, Ohio created, or?
I'm gonna say if they're not, you would have to register them to do business in Ohio if they weren't. But I don't know that for a fact. And all of ours are Ohio LLCs. Even the Ohio holding company that's owned by our Wyoming LLCs individually come together to own the one Ohio, and then everything else is Ohio underneath that. So I don't know for a fact what the right answer is there, but for those Ohio LLCs, we have our property management company set up all of those because all of our mail goes to their office anyway. They sign as the registered agent on all of the forms that get filed to the Secretary of State. So we messed some of those up initially. Like my partner Ethan's name is on like our flipping company, I think, on like the articles of incorporation. So he'll get some calls every once in a while when whatever skip tracing services jumps a layer and ends up skip tracing off of him. But yeah, now we have our property management company or our attorney file all of those entities and sign as the registered agent
in Ohio. Yep.
In Ohio. Yep.
So the one or the two Wyoming LLCs, what do you call them again? Are those the holding LLCs?
Yeah, so I mean, there's not like a specific difference between them, but they are individually owned. So there's 2 in Wyoming, one for me, one for my partner that we individually own. And to be honest, those are like BS operating agreements that they provide. We're in the process of having our attorney draft better operating agreements that, especially as we start to work with more partners, like my partner and I personally, we're fine with the BS operating agreement. It's not going to like affect us in any way, hopefully. But as we, work with more partners, we have been kind of like beefing up our operating agreements.
But it does give you, like you said, that initial layer of anonymity and liability protection. So
Exactly. Yeah.
taxes is a different story that I'm sure you handle in Ohio, but yep.
Right.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Who issues the K1? You said there's one K1. Is that?
Yeah. So
That's Red Door?
1K1 gets produced from the Ohio Holding Company, and that gets
Red
distributed.
Door, right? Yeah.
Exactly. That passes
Interesting.
up, pass through. So one return for Red Door equities for everything. K1 gets issued to me in my Wyoming holding company. That's a pass through. So it just goes to me and goes on my personal tax return. Same thing for Ethan, goes up to his Wyoming, pass through to him, and then goes on his personal.
Okay. Great. Thanks very much.
Definitely. We kill the recording right now.